All right, we're back. So we had, in the first video, we talked about the first five slides, including the title. So really, first four. And as part of that, we had talked about how the walls of the diaphysis, we said, was compact bone. And then we said the outer surface of all of the entire outer surface of the bone was compact bone. But we said in the epiphysis, we had spongy bone. And so, and we had said it was like little beams. But rather than thinking about it right now, I want to take a look at what bone kind of looks like under a microscope. So if you view compact bone under a microscope, if you view it through a microscope, what you see is a bunch of little round circles, basically, and they have rings in them. So they're kind of like a tree trunk, but a whole lot of them. They're microscopic, and you have huge numbers of these things. So if you look at them carefully, though, you see in the very center, there's a hole. Now, that is called the central canal. Do not confuse that microscopic opening in the middle of an osteon for a medullary cavity. They're totally different. They're totally different scale here. But they are connected to that medullary cavity. So remember, we said in the medullary cavity of the bone, there are blood vessels and nerves. And we said bone is highly vascular. Well, if bone is like concrete or a rock, how do you get all of those blood vessels and nerves out into the bone? That's how, the central canal. So we have all of these little circular units, and each circle is called an osteon. So each of these circles is called an osteon, and in the very center of every one of them is a central canal, and there's going to be blood vessels and nerves that are going to be passing through those, and they're going to be connected to the medullary cavity. Now, we had said they look like a tree trunk cut off. And so that means there is something else there, right? It's not just empty space. And what we call that something is hydroxyapatite. It's a calcium phosphate. So hydroxyapatite is the calcium phosphate matrix that is the hard rock-like material. Now, if you're into building bridges or buildings, you know concrete has to have something else inside of it to be able to be strong in all dimensions. And what would that be? I'll wait. I hear nothing. Okay, I'll go on and tell you then. It has rebar, right? So there's steel reinforcing in concrete. Well, bone is kind of the same way, except we don't use steel. We use a protein, a fibrous protein called collagen. So bone consists of the matrix itself, the hydroxyapatite, with embedded collagen fibers. And so when we look at these osteons, we'd said we have a central canal, and then we have layers of that hydroxyapatite. And what do we call those layers? Lamellae. So there's all these layers of lamellae, and inside of there, really, really tiny, because we're already microscopic, but really, really tiny, there are little teeny tiny openings that are called lacunae. And who lives in that opening? Bone cells, osteocytes. Osteocytes and I just drew these as little dots because that's when you look at it under a microscope, that's what it looks like. But inside of each of these little dots, it's a small opening called the lacunae with a cell, with an osteocyte. Now, what did we say? We said bone is a form of connective tissue. And how did we define connective tissue? We said connective tissue consists of cells in a matrix that they secrete. So, where do you think the bone matrix came from? The bone cells. So when we were talking before, and I was talking about that periosteum on the outside of the diaphysis of the bone, one of the things I forgot to mention is this is the osteogenic layer. What does that mean? It means it's where bone is built. So you have where you have a lot of bone building activity. So all of this bone is produced by a specific kind of a bone cell called an osteoblast. Now, one of the things, another function of bone, and I've said this, is that it contributes to other physiologies. Well, it ends up, calcium ions are really important for muscle contraction and nerve function. So when you have excess calcium in your diet, it gets put in your bones, and then when you need it, it gets taken out of your bones. And so maybe you know somebody who has a problem with brittle or having weak bones, osteoporosis. And this is because bone is constantly changing. It's a dynamic tissue. At times you have denser bones than other times. I was trying to think if I needed to say anything else. I think that's it for right here. So we have the osteons, and they even have another name for this system of osteons. It's the Haversian system. That's another term that you might run into. Yeah, that's it for right now. I'm going to talk now, here in a minute, we'll talk about how do we get those blood vessels from the medullary cavity out into these central canals. And then we'll talk a little bit more about spongy bone.